There is a site in San Francisco contaminated by radioactive and toxic waste. It's the historic naval shipyard sitting right next to the Bayview Hunters Point neighborhood.
The base is a federal Superfund site. It was put on the national priorities list in 1989. It was one of the most heavily contaminated properties in the country. The EPA assigns a hazard ranking score of 1 to 100. The average is 50, and the Hunters Point shipyard was 80 overall and 100 for groundwater migration. That means there was an 80 to 100% risk that all of these toxins would be exposing, sensitive receptors, like the children's playground in the churches and the homes that are right at the front door.
Almost every single person in this community has significant illnesses themselves, and almost every single person you meet in this community has a family member or close friend who's has cancer or has died of cancer. So there is a huge epidemic of cancer in this neighborhood.
The bomb is away.
This footage is of nuclear testing conducted during the Cold War in the Marshall Islands. Ships irradiated in the blast were recovered for study.
All of the ships were radioactively poisoned. The ones that made it, didn't sink, were brought back to Hunters Point, and they used sandblasting to try to remove the radioactivity from the ships, creating clouds of radioactive sandblasting dust that blew into the neighborhoods and completely covered the shipyard. It didn't work. The ships remained radioactive. Most of the workers that were involved in the sandblasting all died within a few years. Dr. Sumchai's father worked in the shipyard, and he died at a young age. And then they said it was due to asbestosis. But guess what? Plutonium inhaled creates the same interstitial fibrosis in the lung as asbestos does. So he probably had both. But the biggest pollution source in that neighborhood was the radioactivity.
Now, they probably paid some consultant to come up with this plan. What about the health things that everybody's been talking about? What about that landfill?
Despite outcry over falsified safety tests and unfinished cleanups, the government continues to allow housing to be developed right next to the contaminated sites.
Our concern is that there is not a medical monitoring that you need for people who are living and working, within feet of these activities that are obviously sources of exposure. People in city government, including the Navy, continue to say that there's not a risk of exposure. It's a federal Superfund site. To be on the national priority list, by definition, you have to pose a risk to health of the environment. That's what it means to be on a federal Superfund. The degree of exposure that people are faced with, and the potential for this type of exposure disseminating with things like climate change and sea level rise, and some of the extreme weather events that occurred even this year that are the reason why we're here.
Scientists like Dr. Porter Sumchai and Dr. Dahlgren aim to gather evidence of harmful effects residents experience. That evidence is found in the form of urine samples. The Bayview Hunters Point Biomonitoring Foundation tests residents for toxic chemicals and biomarkers. Then, they pin subjects with significant concentrations of toxic chemicals on a map of the neighborhood.
We have another screening I can show you. I call it the breast cancer necklace, where we just put a pin at the address of a woman who had been diagnosed with breast cancer. And what you get is a pattern that effectively semicircles the base with the landfill in the center.
The chemicals that cause cancer, of course, are coming from the shipyard. I think that Dr. Sumchai and Ariane have been trying to get money to do proper studies for a while now. The studies that she's done have all been done either with Medicare paying for it or the people paying for it themselves. There's been no funding.
It is important to emphasize, especially to students, how powerful young people can play in helping to spark, grassroots activism and, kind of boots on the ground organizing. Because again, that's been what's shown to bring communities through these types of crises.
In our next video, we focus on resident Ariane Harrison, who is carrying on her mother's legacy through community activism.